Hello and welcome to Dialogue. After 9 years in power, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced his resignation as Prime Minister and also as head of the ruling Liberal Party once a new party leader is chosen. Trudeau is facing a revolt within his caucus and dismal public opinion polls, which indicates that his party is likely to lose to the Conservatives in the October general election. What are the major factors that lead to Trudeau's decision? Could a new leader help save the Liberal Party from losing the election to the Conservatives? And how is Canada dealing with its many economic issues and even a possible trade war with the U.S.? Join us for our live discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor Michel Chossudovsky, Director of Center on Research for Research on Globalization, and Benoit Hardy-Chartrand, Faculty Lecturer of Political Science and International Affairs from Temple University, Japan, and Professor Radhika Desai from Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. Welcome to Dialogue. So Michel, I'll start with you. For the past 9 months, many have been asking Trudeau if he would step down. So, his step down is not really surprising for a lot of people. But what are the factors that have led to his resignation here?
Well, I think it's certainly a lack of leadership at a time of crisis. And bear in mind also, the crisis is at the international level. It is also a crisis of Canada's welfare state. It's the link between the provinces and the federal government, which he has misled politicians as well as the public in that regard. There's a process of impoverishment in Canada. There are people who are sleeping in the streets. That is essentially the situation. But I would say misunderstanding of major economic and social issues, an absolute failure with regard to fiscal. We are in a fiscal crisis. We have debts and so on. And there's a war in Ukraine, okay? Now, the position also taken with regard to the war in Ukraine is very important because they're also supporting a Nazi government. And that is something which has to be addressed. And internally, Trudeau has not really come to terms in a dialogue with the provinces. It's a federal provincial structure. So that in a nutshell, that would be my understanding of what's happening. As an economist, the management of the budget and finance and so is totally incompetent. And then internally within the parliamentary system, there's a lack of dialogue, lack of dialogue, and more generally also it's the relationship that Trudeau has with ordinary Canadians. It's a lack of concern. We've never had such a prime minister of this nature. But we must look at what is the future, and the Conservative Party is not necessarily the solution with regard to Poilievre.
Okay, we'll come back to that, the competition between the two parties there. But Benoit, of course, if you look at the economic challenges, for example, inflationary pressure and the rising costs, people are not happy with that, housing debts, etc. But this situation is not unique to Canada, right? To many Western governments, you do see inflationary pressure, people are not happy. I'm wondering, to what degree should the people blame Trudeau for this?
Well, I mean, we've seen, as you mentioned, this phenomenon not only in Canada, Inflation has also hit Japan, where I am located, even though the inflationary pressures has been a little bit more controlled here, but in much of the West, we have seen that inflation. So there are limited things in terms of how governments can respond to inflation. Otherwise, we would not have seen these kinds of levels of inflation in much of the world over the past few years. But certainly, inflationary pressures and the inflation trends in Canada have been very negative over the last few years. I just came back from Canada just a few weeks ago, and this is almost all that people were talking about. And it's in large part, it explains in large part, it's not the only reason, but explains why we have seen such negative appraisals of the Trudeau government over the last few years. And that's why we have seen very little support, and how we've seen dwindling support to record lows in recent times. And one of the main reasons also that has led to all that pressure on him resigning.
Well, Benoit, of course, there's, as earlier the professor mentioned about the leadership or the lack of it. And of course, even within this Liberal Party, you do see there's division, disputes. For example, the resignation of his former deputy prime minister and the finance minister of Chrystia Freeland. People say, her departure is a fatal blow to the leadership of the country. Is that so?
Yeah, I would say in large part that is, because even though we have seen pressures mounting on the prime minister for months now, what happened in early December was really an important blow, probably one of the hardest political blows that he's had to face within his party since coming to power in 2015. Freeland, who was a very important cabinet member ever since Trudeau was elected prime minister in 2015. So the fact that she resigned sent a signal that even the closest allies of the prime minister were now leaving, basically abandoning the ship. And not only that, but when she resigned, she released in her resignation letter, she had fairly scathing words for the prime minister. She talked about political gimmicks. These were the kind of words that you don't expect from somebody who had been a close friend and ally of the prime minister. So after she resigned, there was very little chance of him staying on much longer. And in fact, he stayed very silent for a few weeks until the pressure could no longer be borne. And he tried to reshuffle the cabinet, but that didn't. Well, he did reshuffle the cabinet, but that didn't change much in terms of the outlook of the government. So yes, basically her resignation was probably the last straw for his government.
So Michel, how do you look at the differences between Freeland, important figure of the Liberal Party, and of course the Prime Minister himself?
Well, Freeland was always occupying a sort of number two position, and there's a lot of controversy concerning Freeland because she is supportive of a particular party in the Ukraine, so she is of Ukrainian origin, okay, and her grandfather was tied into the Nazis during World War II. I don't want to personalize this, but I think it's very important, particularly when she was dealing with foreign affairs, and then she gets into finance. I don't think she has much understanding of the economic crisis that we're living, and that economic crisis is true. It affected many countries around the world, but there's certain things that you can do. There's the issue of housing. You can subsidize housing. You can reduce the interest rates that people have on their credit card. These are things that can be done. Mm-hmm. You can also regulate the price of fuel. These are the factors which actually trigger inflation. Now, this is something which politicians can do is to regulate the economy with a view to implementing social programs and coming to the rescue of people who are unemployed. There are lots of bankruptcies now, enormous amounts of bankruptcies. And we knew this back in 2020. Now we're in 2025, and they're not even tackling the issue of bankruptcies. Farmers who are literally destabilized, and it's in a large country, and we also need the support of the provincial governments, and his relations with the provincial governments are totally inept.
So there are obviously a lot of problems to be dealt with. So Radhika, how do you look at, describe for us, what is the situation for Canadian economy? We know that for example, the currency depreciation by 8% against the US dollar. But again, Canada is not alone. Many currencies, depreciated against the dollar. And also household debt has been rising significantly with increasing rents and mortgage payments and overall rising costs. So what lies at the root of these problems? Why do you see there's a failure for the Trudeau government to deal with that challenge?
Absolutely. So first of all, the situation of the Canadian economy is very problematic. In addition to the inflation that you mentioned, the debt problems that you mentioned, there is a huge housing crisis. There is also a problem with both growth and productivity growth, which also means that there is a relatively low scale of investment, which has never been addressed by this government. The government has really, when the government took office first back in 2015, it made a lot of song and dance about how it is going to reject the neoliberal shibboleths about how you should keep the deficit low and so on. It claimed the Trudeau and Freeland and many others, David Dodge, who had been a former governor of the Bank of Canada, all these people were in the Liberal team, and they all claimed that they were going to follow a very new path. But in reality, the Trudeau government over the last 9 years has been a massive disappointment as far as addressing the economy is concerned. And of course, after the shock of the pandemic, it has never been able to recover. So the Canadian economy is suffering very badly.
Of course, recently we do see, if you've said, he announced his resignation, next step, people will look at who will replace him. What about the performance, of the Liberal Party? If you look at the opinion polls, it's like a 16-13 approval rate percent. That is, dismal, people would say. So who will be the likely next leader to replace Trudeau? And what about the election between the Liberal and the Conservative, Radhika?
You mean in the UK?
You mean, of course, upcoming Trudeau is taking care of the government, of course. There will be a new leader inside the Liberal Party.
Correct. And, there will be two different elections. Yeah. So there will be two different elections in the sense that there should be an election for the leadership of the Liberal Party itself. And then, yes, there could be an election much earlier than you imagine. I mean, basically what Trudeau has done is he has put back the meeting of Parliament. Parliament was supposed to meet in the last week of January, I think on the 27th, if that's the Monday. And Trudeau has essentially obtained from the Governor General a prorogation of Parliament, which means that it will now meet only towards the end of March. And even then, he has decided to call Parliament on that day because he needs to pass an important bill to keep the government going. Now, here's the interesting thing. If the opposition parties decide to bring him down, which they may or may not do, but if they decide to vote against that bill, a new election will be precipitated, which will create a very complex situation if the Liberal Party has not yet chosen a leader, because then it means that the Liberal Party will be going into the next election with Justin Trudeau still at the helm, because he has said he will be the leader until the party has chosen a new leader. If they want to avert that situation, they will have to have a very hurried hurried process of electing a leader. It is normally a 4-month long process, but now they will have to shorten it to about 2 months. And that's going to be very difficult. On top of that, there are various other concerns. You know, all the parties in Canada have been slinging mud at one another, trying to delegitimize their processes and trying to delegitimize the electoral victory, that is to say, the ordinary elections victories of each other's candidates, by saying there has been foreign interference, Chinese interference, etc., in these elections. And now, once again, a lot of the chatterati are talking about how the Liberals cannot have a fully open election process, because that is going to inevitably open the door to foreign interference, and that will delegitimize the process. Now, if they accept that and decide to have a more closed process, perhaps confined only to the MPs, then of course they will essentially have also be committing an anti-democratic error, in the sense the election of whatever leader is elected will still be illegitimate, because he or she will have been elected only by the MPs and not by the mass base of the party in the country. So
Right.
it's really interesting. And you also asked me who is going to fight. Now, of course, we all know many names have been bandied about: Mark Carney, Chrystia Freeland. Mark Carney, who was the former governor of the Bank of
Thank you.
Canada, later on went on to become the first foreign governor of any major central bank when he headed the Bank of England. He has written, he's very much part of the Liberal Party brand, particularly the Justin Trudeau Liberals. He has been advising them for a long time, so he's one. Chrystia Freeland is another. Chrystia Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister, former Finance Minister, central to this government. Many would say that, she was, if anybody had brains in the government, she was it, not Justin Trudeau. There are many other names being bandied about: Dominic LeBlanc, Christy Clark, who is has been the Premier of BC. So there are many names, but you rightly ask, who would want to be the leader of a party that is known to be a rapidly sinking ship?
Yeah.
The Liberals, Justin Trudeau's approval ratings are at a rock bottom. We know that. But so is that of the Liberal Party. If an election were held today, there is absolutely no doubt that the Conservatives would win,
Will win,
hands
yeah.
down. And so there it is. I mean, it's going to Canada is in a very, very difficult and complex situation, precipitated by its own prime minister.
Right, very difficult time. But Benoit, of course, the internal challenges aside, you do have external challenges. Your neighbor, Canada's neighbor, of course, the upcoming president of the U.S. is talking about annexing Canada, 51st state. Do you think he's joking, or he's seriously mauling taking over Canada?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're asking this question. When Trump first made this comment, I think it was about a month or two ago, not long after he was elected as the next president, it was quite surprising. It was even laughable that he would suggest that. Most people thought that this was probably a one-time joke, right? But what's been crazy is that he's repeated that assertion quite a few times. He's continuously mocked Canada as the 51st state of the United States. He's done that quite a few times since then. And of course, as many people know, it's not only been Canada. He's also talked about annexing Greenland, which belongs to Denmark. He's also talked about Panama and the Panama Canal. So the question here is given how many times he has spoken about Canada as the 51st U.S. state, what's his goal here? Is he, at first we thought, he was just trolling, and it's likely that he still is just trolling, having a bit of fun. I mean, Donald Trump has shown many times again that he is often a deeply unserious politician. So that could be just him wanting to troll Canada. But he's repeated it many times. So that might be something a bit more than that. Is it some kind of opening negotiation tactic, just like promising very high tariffs in order to obtain something in return? Because Donald Trump and his team around him have to know that there's no chance that Canadians would agree to that. As much as Trump has said that many Canadians would like to be the 51st state of the United States. If you look at opinion polls in Canada, there's nothing that shows anywhere close to support for that idea. The most recent poll that I found just a couple of weeks ago in December was that only 5% of Canadians would want that. And since he said that, there's been a few other public figures in Canada. I'll just give you the example of Kevin O'Leary, who is a businessman and a TV personality, who's also said that he supports that idea and that many Canadians would like that idea. But this is just this. There's no relation with reality. There's no evidence at all that any more than a tiny minority of Canadians would support becoming the United States 51st state. So yeah, it's been a really interesting and strange turn of events for seeing the next president repeat that strange assertion.
So Michel, of course, people would say Trudeau somehow, demonstrated that he's not able to handle Donald Trump in terms of being, bullied or being insulted by the upcoming president. And of course, that's adding to his, let's say, not a plus for him in terms of the premiership. And Donald Trump also talked about 25% tax, tariffs on Canadian imports. So what's his true purpose? Obviously, he's for something. He's pressuring Canada for something, right?
Well, I mean, when Trump made the statement on Canada becoming the 51st state of the United States of America, I think that statement was very carefully. It wasn't simply a dinner, joking relationship that they had at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence. I think that this was probably discussed with his senior advisors, but it is something that a head of government in Canada would have to respond in very clear terms, because what it really involves is annexation, and annexation is in effect it's an illegal act. We have the Confederation in Canada, which dates back to 1867. And in 1866, there was an annexation project of the United States. Now, Canada-US relations have to be negotiated very carefully. But the statement of Donald Trump is simply saying, well, you're no longer a nation state. That's really what it is. Now, I must say, although I don't particularly favor Poilievre, but he made the statement, we're a nation state. We collaborate with the United States. We may have differences, but I think the problem here is the alignment. What kind of an alignment will a Canadian government have with Washington? Mm-hmm. And this is particularly important at a time of where we have two war theaters simultaneously in the Middle East and then in Eastern Europe, where Canadians, we've had, historically, Canada has played a role in peacemaking. Now, I would hope that the next Prime Minister will play that role, but I don't see Poilievre actually doing that, because he's made statements, pretty awful statements about encouraging Israel to attack Iran. Now, you don't make those statements, particularly inciting essentially a situation which could lead to World War III. We don't need to get into that, but it's a very serious matter that our Prime Minister, our next Prime Minister, and our next government will be committed to world peace and will take those initiatives as it has historically.
Well, so Radhika, obviously, externally, Canada is also facing challenges not only from the United States, but also with a poor relationship with major powers, with India, with Russia, with China, of course. So in particular, because Trump is going back to the White House on the 20th, is very soon. Obviously, there will be an issue to deal with that kind of pressure. If there's a 25% tariffs on the Canadian exports, do you think there's a plan? What Canada will do to deal with that?
I think that, first of all, yes. I would say, I think there's a couple of things to bear in mind before we jump into the exact question you asked. The first thing is that most countries in the world aren't half as vulnerable as Canada and Mexico are to the tariff threats that Trump has made. Canada and Mexico are deeply integrated and they would be very badly hurt, whereas for most other countries, their exports to the United States may be significant, but if they were stopped or they were radically reduced, it would be a shock. It would be a shock to them, but it would be a shock they could recover from. From the point of view of Canada, this is not the case. And what we see is, so bearing this in mind, Trudeau has created a crisis of leadership in Canada by essentially his refusal to go earlier and allow time for a leader to be elected, given the possibility that there could be a Trump administration. He didn't do that. He hung on to the last minute and in the end resigned only because he absolutely had to. Too many things came together, forcing him to do so. So now there's going to be a leadership crisis. At the critical point when Canada needs a strong spokesperson, it will not have one. And so this is going to put Canada in a very difficult situation already in any negotiations with the United States. And the United States, seeing that vulnerability, I agree with Michel that Trump is, Trump will try anything. So I forget the exact words he used, but he's somebody to be wary about. And especially seeing Canada's vulnerability, we don't know what he's going to try. And also remember that Canada and Mexico have reacted very differently. Both were threatened by equally threatening tariffs, but the Canadians sort of went and rolled over and said, rub my belly sort of thing by Trump's, Justin Trudeau visiting Mar-a-Lago. Claudia Sheinbaum, on the other hand, said to Trump in no uncertain terms that Mexico will take its own actions if Trump were to impose the sorts of measures that he was talking about, whether it was about tariffs or deportations or what have you. So Trudeau had already thrown that towel in. Now he's created a major leadership crisis. And I would say, in addition to the problems that Michel mentioned and the other panelists mentioned, I would add one other thing. Canada is already in a weird position right now. Canada is suffering from a weird political situation in which all the political issues that are being discussed are false issues. We are discussing immigration. We are discussing all sorts of things that really are not where the problems really lie. And I think that it is very possible that whether to join the United States as a 51st state will become another false debate that the Canadians will have. I agree with the previous speaker that there is no evidence that there is great popular desire to join the United States. I see absolutely none. Canadians define themselves by saying that we are not Americans. So but at the same time, you could create huge problems if prominent people start talking about accepting this offer.
Absolutely.
And of course, there is absolutely going to be no shortage of people like Elon Musk and other CEOs recommending the same thing. So Canada is in for a very, very confusing time, very, very complex time.
Well, very complex in time. On that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.